Alaikum salam. It's a great pleasure to be in Singapore. Yes, indeed, surfing behind the wall, my Palestinian journey has been a very long journey. The initial episodes, initial chapters from this book were written as a radio series called Letters from Palestine as long as 10 years ago. And what happened as I started to visit Palestine more and more over a 10-year period, the idea of converting these radio programs into a book was born. But at the same time, in converting it into a book, I ended up doing a tremendous amount of research and interviewing a lot of people. Fortunately, working at a radio station, I was able to put a lot of these guests on air. But I would estimate that I've interviewed at least 500 role players in the Palestinian scenario, right from members of Likud, from the Knesset, from the Israeli Knesset, right through to Islamic Jihad, Hamas, essentially all the elements of the Palestinian landscape.
It is early days yet, but how has response been so far to your book and talks you've given on the topic?
So far, alhamdulillah, the response appears to have been positive. The most satisfying response that I've had to date is that people say that it's helped them to understand the situation a bit better and that they've learned things from it which they didn't know before, which is quite satisfying, especially when you've done about 10 years of research. So it's very good from that aspect. There has been some criticism. We had members of the Israeli embassy last night at a function. But of course, in the spirit of things, we accept all criticism. And of course, we listen to what people have to say and we move on from there. But generally speaking, alhamdulillah, I've been very happy with the reception and the way that the sales have been going so far.
In last night's talk, you mentioned several times how, as a South African, you could relate somewhat to the struggles of the Palestinian. Could you elaborate more on that, please?
You see, how we relate to the Palestinian problem as a South African is that we experienced the apartheid system. And what apartheid was based on was discrimination on your race, on your ethnic grouping. And what made apartheid bad in South Africa was that this was official government policy. For example, we would have park benches that would say non-whites or whites only. If you caught a bus, you had to either ride upstairs, you couldn't catch the bus. You couldn't go to beaches. You couldn't go to certain public places. Certain shops were closed off to you. You couldn't even visit certain hotels. It was such a ridiculous system. If you take my case, for example, under the apartheid system, I was classified as European, but my wife wasn't. And our relationship was actually against the law, which would have meant that our children would have been regarded as illegitimate according to the laws of the country. So that's just an example. In fact, my wife and myself fell under what was called the Immorality Act, that people could not have any kind of relationship across what they would call the color bar. The other aspect of apartheid, which was especially bad, was that if you were a black person, you would have to carry a passbook. And if you didn't have your passbook, you could be arrested and put into jail. And your passbook would confine you to a certain geographical area. Now, if you fast forward to the Palestinian situation, you also see a systematic method, a systematic discrimination against Palestinians, even to the extent where some of it is in law. I mean, for example, Palestinians have to carry their cards. You find that West Bank cars have different number plates to cars inside 1948 Israel. You find that Palestinians are confined to the West Bank, or they're confined to Gaza, and if they wanted to live in 1948 Israel, they would not be allowed to do. So the same restrictions on freedom of movement during apartheid are experienced in Palestine. During South African apartheid, you had 80% of the country confined to less than 10% of the land. You'll find in Palestine, the numbers are different because Palestinians are slightly over 50% of the population, but you find that they're also being confined to areas of land that are shrinking due to the building of settlements in places on the West Bank. So having experienced apartheid, and I experienced apartheid from both sides, because when I became a Muslim during the apartheid era, I lost my white European identity. In fact, I became a non-identity person because I was a Muslim and the government didn't know how to classify me. So I was in no man's land, as it were. as I was saying, what happened to me during the apartheid years was I essentially lost my identity. And from that, I think I learned a lot about what happens in a situation where you are discriminated against because of your skin color, ethnic grouping, creed, or whatever you might believe in. Now, again, to take the situation into Palestine, we have to make it very clear that apartheid enjoys a generic definition according to international law. So, apartheid that is in Israel, for example, is not a carbon copy of South African apartheid. We have to make this very, very clear distinction. We are using the word apartheid generically in the sense that it's discrimination against another ethnic group, which in this case is Palestinians. To say it's similar to South Africa is not true. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, for example, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, a South African, very famous South African cleric, has actually said publicly that he personally feels that the Palestinian situation was far worse than what he ever saw during apartheid. I've also spoken to several senior ANC members, such as Ibrahim, who is our Deputy Foreign Minister, who agrees with the sentiments of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And Mr. Ibrahim was an election monitor for the South African government during the year 2006. I've spoken to other senior ANC members, African National Congress, our ruling party, who also suffered under apartheid and who've also come to similar conclusions. So when one hears that apartheid is worse than Israel, it's not just Shafiq that's saying it. These are people who have serious clout, serious political. These are people who know what they're talking about.
Being in a conflict zone such as Palestine is surely a heartbreaking but memorable one. What are some of the images or stories that you cannot forget during your trips there?
In fact, when you go to parts of the world where there's a lot of suffering, the funny thing is that what you remember most are what I would call the sweet moments. And I will never forget, for example, the kindness of Sheikh Abdul Aziz Bukhari, who in fact was a Naqshbandi Sheikh of Jerusalem. And what struck me about this man was that in the midst of all of this turmoil, here was a man of perfect peace, and a man who was trying to make everybody around him peaceful. And I can't forget that. Another memorable occasion in Palestine was sitting right underneath the rock of the Mi'raj in the cave, and just being able to make dua between Maghrib and Isha one evening, right under the feet, right under the feet of the Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the same spot where he ascended into the heavens, and that was a magic moment. And you sit at a spot like that, and there's all this turmoil and chaos going outside, and inside Al-Aqsa you find this incredible spiritual peace. In fact, very few people know that inside the Al-Aqsa mosque itself is in fact a zawiyah. And if you go there, there's a sort of an enclosed area, you open the door, and inside there you will see all sorts of pious people making their dhikr at any time of the day or night.